Sokwe, Ani, Kenzie, hello and good afternoon, friends. I would like to start by welcoming you to our sixth lecture in the Indigenous Women Speaker Series, an event held since 2017. We will begin today's event with a territorial acknowledgement. Thank you. So as this meeting is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, that you take on the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As members of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of the institution. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge our current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region.
This land acknowledgement is the beginning of responsibilities incumbent upon York University administrators, faculty, and students, including in our everyday tasks in the university. The Center for Feminist Research and the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages Indigenous Women Speaker Series is part of this responsibility for making space in the Academy for Indigenous women's and Indigenous feminist voices. The Center for Feminist Research is therefore pleased to co-organize today's talk following the inaugural lectures, which featured the Cree-speaking Métis feminist and poet Emma Rock, Professors Deborah McGregor, Karen Rickley, and Cheryl Suzak, Professor Joyce Green, Sherritt McGyver, Professor Jay Kehawani, and Professor Mashuna Goman. Today, we were very pleased to have as our guest two amazing academic scholars, and Dr. Vanessa Watts sends her regrets just for a non-serious illness, but that makes it difficult for her to participate today. So we're very pleased to have with us today Professor Kim Anderson and Dr. Jennifer Adese. My name is Elaine Coburn. I'm a first-generation Canadian on Indigenous lands, and I'm the director of the Center for Feminist Research at York University. I'm pleased to introduce my co-organizer for the event, Professor Sean Hillier, who is a Mi'kmaq scholar from the Hullapu First Nation and associate professor and York Research Chair in Indigenous Health Policy and One Health, and the director of the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages.
So this lecture series continues to mark an important historical moment for the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, the Center for Feminist Research, and York University more broadly, in its demonstration of its commitment to coming together with prominent Indigenous scholars from across North America to listen and to learn. Through this process, may we begin to understand the impact of colonization on the spaces and places in which we study, live, and work.
We would especially like to thank the co-sponsors for this event, the Center for Feminist Research and the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, and the VPRI Office Special Events Funds for Indigenous Scholarship.
And so for the format for today's event will be short commentaries from our two panelists, so 10 to 15 minutes each, followed by approximately 30 minutes or so of moderate questions and answers. The final 30 minutes will be reserved for you to ask your questions and to have responses from our panelists. During the discussion, please feel free to submit questions using the chat function. Elaine and I will be monitoring these throughout the event, and we'll pose them back to the panelists when we get to that section. We also ask that you keep yourself muted and video off unless you're asking a question. So I'm pleased to introduce Kim Anderson, who is a Métis Associate Professor in the Department of Family Relations and Applied Nutrition at the University of Guelph, where she holds the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Relationships. Her books include A Recognition of Being, Reconstructing Native Womanhood, and the Life Stages and Native Women Memory, Teachings, and Story Medicine.
And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Adese, who is the Canada Research Chair in Métis Women, Politics and Community, and an Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto Mississauga. She is the author of Aboriginal Trademark, The Cultural and Economic Politics of Recognition, and the co-editor of A People and a Nation, New Directions in Contemporary Métis Studies by UBC Press, as well as Indigenous Celebrity, the University of Manitoba Press. Her work has been published in journals including TOPIA, the American Indian Quarterly, SAIL, Studies in American Indian Literatures, MediaTropes, Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education and Society, and appears in select edited anthologies on Indigenous land rights, colonization, art, activism, and resistance. And with that, I welcome Professor Kim Anderson to begin.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good lunchtime or whatever it is for you. Thank you for the invite, Elaine. We were just reminiscing about other events that we did together. So it's nice to be back in this space and having this conversation. So I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes about my own thinking and journey around Indigenous women, studying my own work through my own identity and gender. And I'm hoping that we can sort of open this up and have like I said, like a groovy conversation amongst all the folks that are here, which was, I think, the intention of it. So I may be brief. So I'll just start out by saying I got invited to this Indigenous Women, what's it called? Indigenous Women speaker series. I guess first because I'm an Indigenous woman, but also I have had a career of research and study around Indigenous women and gender and Indigeneity in particular. And I didn't actually, start out thinking about, like, that wasn't my interest at the beginning. And I'll just say that personally, I guess I've been a feminist since I was a kid. I was way back in the day you'd call like a tomboy or whatever. I was always a bit of hanging around with my brother and his friends and doing things like that, and resisting, I guess, what I saw were expectations of women where I grew up in the suburbs outside of Ottawa. So not necessarily thinking about it in terms of Indigenous communities, but I guess from the early age of a kid, like just kind of resisting some of the things that were expectations of women and girls. But what really launched me into a career of research around this was becoming a mother. When I had my first child, when I was by that time 30 years old. And I hadn't really been working with women or in women's issues or with Indigenous women up until that time, but it was that embodied experience of mothering and going through pregnancy and birth and, raising an infant that made me really start to think about how I could learn more about this powerful experience that I was going through and why, and what it had to do with, resisting some of the oppression and the roles that we have as women. So that kind of got me going. It was this, the old me search thing. I was trying to learn more about it. Also, I was very challenged around being a mother because I thought, man, this is really hard work. I don't know how people do it. And with all the privileges that I had, I wanted to find out more about how could this be a more supportive and empowering experience, right? And looking at Indigenous cultures for that. So that's really where I started. But in recent years, and so people think of me sometimes as like all that scholarly work I did earlier on around mothering and motherhood. I have written some more recent articles with my colleague Jennifer Brandt, who many of you probably know. But I also kind of moved away from that. First of all, because of my own position of aging. But also, there's been lots of challenges around that the ideology of mothering in Indigenous cultures, thinking about the empowerment of mothering as a metaphor. There's been challenges around that, around how it's, kind of like essentialist and restrictive. And so I've been trying to figure that out. So part of it is that. And in some ways, just kind of wanting to like move away from that and thinking, well, maybe there's not a place for exploring those questions around, the power of mothering in Indigenous communities. Maybe we've outgrown that in terms of thinking about gender. But I have been reminded by Jen Brandt and doing work with her. She says, well, yeah, but what about there's still something about the power of the maternal body, which is where I started, right? Which is where I began with my own body and trying to figure out what that meant in terms of how to sort of like carry yourself in the world, how to be in relation with other people, and what that gave me, right? So you know, I kind of go back and forth with that. But of course, as I've now obviously moved beyond the maternal body myself, and I'm now you know, an older woman and an auntie and a grandmother, I'm thinking more in the me search category about what does that mean? And how do I begin to take up responsibilities in communities such that I've learned about in the research that I've done historically about what women and girls do throughout their life stages. And again, thinking about, you know, is there, what is the place of gender? What is the place of being a woman within that? Or, you know, is there a place? Is there such a thing as an auntie or a granny? We all know that there is, but like, what does that mean? And how do we start to unpack that versus being kind of like a genderless, older person in Indigenous community who carries, of course, responsibilities that we all do as we age, right? As elders or as aunties and uncles and older people in the community. So I've been thinking about how I translate those things into the here and now of where I am. And one of the ways I've done that is to bring it into my day job, which, you know, I spend, I don't know how many hours a week doing this job as a professor and trying to think about how do I translate where I'm at in terms of my age and my gender into the responsibilities I carry out on a day-to-day basis. And so what I've done is with my students and my lab, my research lab that I have, all my students that work within it, is built it like a family. And we call our lab meetings kitchen table. So we get together at the kitchen table, which involves eating, cooking together, and discussing, of course, all the work, figuring out how do we share responsibility amongst ourselves, how do we co-teach, how we co-learn, but also sharing, you know, around our lives. And so we have a certain, you know, certain way that we interact together. And I've set it up thinking about how do I take on, how do I be the auntie type in that environment from what I know about how aunties conduct themselves in community. But again, also thinking about what's the role of gender in that, in my own particular, you know, kind of participation in that, and in how I make space for it in and among the lab. So going beyond that, I've also been thinking about physical spaces and what does that mean in terms of gendered spaces. Again, is there a role for that? And how do you construct those kind of spaces? So along with the idea of the kitchen table lab, we're actually building a grandmother's cabin in the University Arboretum. I hope we are. Anyways, we're still, it's been an ongoing thing around funds, right? But anyways, we have a plan. And you know, I'm starting to think about how do you work with creating family, creating community, creating relationality in that land-based space, creating a grandmother's cabin with a kitchen table that we operate at, and with all the relations that are in and around us, right? Is there a place for gender there? Or do we just throw it all out and try to operate in a genderless way going forward? I don't know. These are some of the things that I think about, right? So I'd be interested in hearing what other folks think, both in terms of continuing to challenge some of the work that I've done in the past. And as we started out by saying, you know, I maintain the right to continue to change my mind and continue to change my position on this. And we are kind of like running after the shifting that's going on in terms of how we understand gender, both in the wider society, but also within Indigenous communities, of course. And like, how do we work with this in our day-to-day practice? How do we work with this with our own identities? And I'm just like continuing to try to evolve with that as I go along, right? So, you know, is there, because I've done work in Indigenous masculinities too, I started out with that thinking, well, I started out with Indigenous women's work because I was trying to think about what does it look like to be an Indigenous woman in a non-patriarchal society, which of course we didn't have heteropatriarchal societies among Indigenous communities in the past. And what does that look like? And then I was feeling like we've kind of neglected this question of men and masculinities. And that's why I got into some of that work with me and my colleague, Rob Innes. But then I was like, well, do we just throw it all, like I say, do we just throw it all out? Is there even, what does it mean to have the masculine and feminine question of spirit? Like, how do we work with that? So I have been working with these questions of gender, metaphorically, even with the mothering and motherhood. I always said, it's not about, like, even though my experience was embodied and that's what drove me to it, it brought me into this larger realm of thinking about it metaphorically and how it worked in our societies historically. But it's also, there's an element of spirit there too. And how do we work with the, is there such a thing as that spirit that's helping to bring us around to creating and working within these systems that are supportive of people for however it is they are, and in terms of their spirit, in terms of the way they want to express themselves, in terms of the way they want to relate in community. So all that to say, maybe that's enough. I think about relations and how I just love people, and I like to make space for people to be able to grow and thrive. And I'm constantly thinking about what gender means in terms of that. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm very excited to be here with Jennifer, because these are things that I want to explore with colleagues and also learn more about other people's ongoing work with women. And it's too bad Vanessa can't be here, but maybe we'll hopefully have an opportunity to keep going on these conversations. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kim. Yeah, anyway, it's a nice lay of how the landscape is always shifting, right? And then what does good relations mean, and how do we reinterpret what that means, from our own commitments and standpoints to, supporting people as they are, and in healthy ways. And with that, I'll introduce Dr. Jennifer Adese to say a few words.
Tansei, thank you for inviting me here to speak today, and thank you, Kim, for that kicking us off. You've given me a lot to think about, and I will apologize in advance that I'm going to do a little bit more reading to get my brain shifted. I'm currently on sabbatical, so I'm dreaming of warmer temperatures and not working at all, and I'm also navigating a child health situation at the moment. So I am gonna put my words to paper, and that'll help me kind of transition to the conversation. So thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation with everyone. So what I would, say is that my thinking around Indigenous feminisms has actually been greatly informed by Dr. Anderson's work. I was, I think, a second-year university student, maybe third-year university student, when I first picked up A Recognition of Being, Reconstructing Native Womanhood. And it gave me a language for understanding some of the things that I had heard and seen growing up. And I think about, in particular, my grandmother, Myrtle Lenny, who was born just south of Lac St. Anne in Alberta, in that catchment area. My great-grandmother, Flora Gauthier Lenny, who was well known to be very loving but very firm with anyone who came into her orbit. My great-auntie, or my second grandmother, Louise Lenny, my great-auntie, second grandmother, Helen Perro Lenny, who are all from that area. And they were center in my family and in any of the stories that I heard from my mom when I was growing up in Ontario about my dad's family in Alberta. And certainly when my grandmother would come to visit, she loomed large. It was very clear she was the center of a large network of family relations. And they were the ones at the forefront, raising children, keeping branches of the family connected, holding down jobs, often as domestic workers at the same time. My grandmother was a domestic worker. I also think back to times where I was growing up in the Niagara region, and I worked in the kitchen of the Niagara Regional Native Center alongside mostly Haudenosaunee women, some Mississauga women, but mostly Haudenosaunee women from Six Nations. And having the opportunity as a teenager to listen to their stories and their laughter while I learned how to peel potatoes properly and cut carrots and things like that, cooking for various events. But I also think about, and has started to think about after reading Dr. Anderson's book, what it was to puzzle through some of the more difficult stories that also came up, some of the whispers and the silences, things around violence that would crop up, domestic violence, poverty, sexual violence that would come up in the interstices between the laughter and the joy, the moments of joy. Stories about sterilization, my great-grandmother's own institutionalization in Alberta in a mental health facility during the time of mandatory forced sterilization, my grandmother's time in mental health facilities and receiving electroshock therapy treatments in Alberta under a period in which mandatory sterilization was also a part of the picture. So, you know, I started to think about that and gender discrimination in hiring, housing, education, the struggles that they faced in and alongside the joy. And I think that Dr. Anderson's work in particular, not to, hopefully I'm not, embarrassing you too much, but your legacy is massive in my own life. To think about what it meant to see those things as not just reflections of personal problems or individual failings or individual character flaws, but the result of a deeply unequal system created via a very gendered form of settler colonialism, a racist, patriarchal settler colonialism. And so, her work gave me the language to start thinking about those kinds of things as a young student. And then somewhere along the way, I became interested in how Métis women and other Indigenous women use their voices to do political or to do battle in the political arena of the settler state. And that continues to be my primary set of interests, I would say, is the way that all of these experiences are then channeled into the politics of recognition and contending, carving out space, insisting on space, and shaping, even as problematic as it is, the politics of recognition. This will be my work for the rest of my life. I've already promised that to various Métis women's political organizations that they have me for life. So I put it out there, so I can't back off from that. But I first began kind of formalizing, I guess you could say, that relationship when I was a graduate student in 2006. By some happenstance, I wound up attending one of the board meetings as an alternate delegate of an organization now called Les Femmes Métis otipemisiwak, or in English, Women of the Métis Nation. And from there, I attended the 2007 National Aboriginal Women's Summit, or NAS1, in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, a meeting of what were then called National Aboriginal Organizations, or NAOs, organized around advocating for who were then called Aboriginal women, and meetings with federal and provincial government representatives at the time. It was there that I first met women such as the late Métis elder Marge Friedel, who it turned out was also an extended family member who well knew my dad's family. I brought pictures of my dad's family on the bus, knowing that I was going to meet more Métis women from Alberta beyond myself and my grandmother that I knew growing up. And I happened to be sitting in front of Marge and mustered the courage to turn around and ask her if she knew them. I just handed the family photos over the back of the school bus seat to ask her. And it turns out that Marge was directly responsible for signing my second cookum, my great auntie Helen Lenny, up for a Métis Nation of Alberta membership so that she could get her a 3-bedroom trailer after my auntie had raised 10 kids in a 1-bedroom trailer. They visited for years in the kitchen of that 3-bedroom trailer, a trailer that I would later go to in my first visits back to reconnect with my dad's family in my 20s. It's the trailer where we sat around the kitchen table, her and I and my dad's cousin Paul, eating bannock and freezer jam, fruit pie, and we poured over old family photos that Auntie pulled out of a big old broken down suitcase. And it's where I learned a little bit more about why my grandmother stopped speaking Cree. It was in many ways the first place I felt at home and felt a genuine sense of belonging. Following that Corner Brook meeting, I attended LFMO's AGM that same year in Vancouver in 2007, where I was asked to contribute to their policy work by writing their education policy paper and to present this work at the NAS gathering in 2008 in Yellowknife. I continued to attend various events and gatherings over the years, and in particular, one that stands out to me the most is that I bore witness to the delegation's work at what was called NAS 3 in Winnipeg in the fall of 2012, when National Indigenous Women's Organizations, as they were beginning to be called by that point, called on provincial premiers to unanimously support the calls from the organizations, including LFMO, Paktuatit, Inuit Women's Organization, and NWAC, the Native Women's Association of Canada, to demand a national inquiry regarding the ongoing disappearances and murder of Indigenous women and girls, with Two-Spirit peoples not wholly encompassed by this early discourse and focus, but gradually included more and more. The premiers did not agree to offer unanimous support, but there is no doubt in my mind that their advocacy work and the voices of hundreds of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women, those who work in their communities as mothers, teachers, early childhood educators, cashiers, admin assistants, policy managers, lawyers, doctors, caretakers, and many other roles are why the National Inquiry came into existence. Since then, I have worked to help them, co-authoring reports on the National Inquiry when the National Inquiry failed Métis women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, housing, and early learning and childcare. I've continued to listen to their stories, and when I was pregnant, the wonderful cookums I've met through LFMO rubbed my belly and whispered what I call good earthside things to my child, a kind of love magic that I see in him today when he puts on his little sash and tries to jig, and it's not a very solid jig, but he loves it deep in his heart. And I see it in his presence in the world today. And I center this narrative, and I wanted to start by talking about this because that is where and how and by whom I continue to grow my understanding of feminism as feminism in action, or what Dr. Anderson has referred to as Native feminist spatial practices in the context of our work on indigenizing the academy. As I've been told many times by Melanie Omenio, the president of LFMO, Marge's daughter as well, Linda Boudreau, a Métis elder from Cold Lake, Alberta, the late Rose Gauthier Bordelon, my grandmother's cousin, Annette Maurice, a Métis woman from Prince George, and many others. To do the work of healing the harm of settler colonialism is to do so for the entirety of the Métis Nation, so that our women, girls, and Two-Spirit people may be strong, so our nation may be strong, and so that our children may grow well, and that they do not forget who we are, all of our children, and what our responsibilities are to each other and to the earth. And so, I mean, my work is not generally, I'm not thought of as a feminist scholar. I've encountered that critique on many occasions, that people do not think of, I'm not thought of as a feminist scholar, and that's fair, that's entirely true. I wouldn't say that I've put a lot of that work into paper for an academic audience. It tends to, at the current state, be in another place, but it's the only way, I think, right now that it makes sense to me to continue working through these ideas. And that stage has been different in the past, and it will change in the future. And I will continue probably working in academic conversations about this. But I think by and large, we only have so much capacity. And for me right now, that capacity is trying to use my position as a Métis woman in academia to listen to other women. My voice is not the only one, nor is it the most important one. And so I'd like to take my power, privilege, position, whatever it is, to continue to work to amplify those voices and those definitions of what it is that we might call Indigenous feminism, because the real on the ground consequences and impacts are not impacting my life in the same way anymore, as it is for many of the women that I work with and collaborate with in these arenas. So I'm interested in the conversation and to see where it goes and grows. But yeah, that's a bit about me and how I get to this point.
Thanks. So I can invite a response from you, Kim, or I can throw out a question, whatever you prefer.
Sure. I just thank you, Jennifer. That was really cool to hear that little history there. And actually what comes up to me too is, and what comes up to me in practice too, is how women organize. There's so much to that in terms of how when we gather, when we get together, how we work collectively, how we organize, which is really about, which is really what I've worked in and been part of, you know, throughout my career and throughout my life, right? I've just spent so much time with women and working with women and organizing. And I'm just wondering, where that comes from and why, and what does it have to do with gender and the ways in which we go about, you know, this ethic of care and so on. Is it stuff that's like, you know, what is it stuff that's conditioned in ways that other ways we were conditioned as women to be able to look after each other and to take care of things, which is good. But does it mean that therefore we're taking more responsibility where, you know, others could take responsibility? I don't know. So, but just, I mean, the strength of that is in terms of how we organize and how we gather and how we work together, which is like I was saying, the way I work at Kitchen Table. It's like my people that I work with now are, you know, I still work with women mostly, right? I've had some men in the lab. I've had trans men in my lab, but we're still working and organizing in the ways that I understand and have worked with women all throughout my life, right? So, so yeah, I'm still thinking about that. What does that mean? Because it's very interesting for me, and especially to see how Métis women organize and how they move things forward and so on, and where that comes from, right? So anyway, things that I think about all the time. So thank you for putting that into that context.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why I'm interested in those conversations and why I've always been interested in them, but I mean, at least from some of the work that I've done on political movements around the time of the Constitution, I mean, so much of it really comes from, I think, coalescing around an exclusion, and really during the time of the Constitution, the active exclusion and minimization and tight management of Métis women's voices led to this real sense of urgency to develop some kind of autonomous body that could then bypass what, you know, to today is still known as the Métis National Council. Because in the 1980s and in that period, the Métis National Council, even when it received funding from the federal government to include Métis women's voices, often did not channel that funding down to women's collectives to organize, and definitely not in timely manners. And I think it's reflective of wider conversations that were happening among the National Indian Brotherhood, or what becomes AFN, that dealing with gender or whatever's going on around gender is an internal politics of the nation in which Canada doesn't have the right to interfere. And so I think it kind of, you know, for me, from what I've seen, it develops alongside that mentality that, well, we'll deal with internal problems of gender on our own terms, and we don't, we're not overly concerned with amplifying women's voices in these contexts or anything, you know, like that. And I think that it ultimately gave rise to the development of two organizations, the what is today the autonomous LFMO, but then another one within MNC that was developed to sort of, I think, kind of head off the work that was being done by women outside of MNC, and to kind of have a hand still in controlling that narrative and shaping that narrative. And so that kind of created challenges for a long time, I think, in the growing of an autonomous political body akin to Paktuatit and akin to NWAC, specifically focused for Métis women. But I could ramble about that extensively and quite a bit, because I think that it's something that's, so recently I've been interviewing, I just came out of a segment of interviewing young people who identify as women and or as Two-Spirit about their experiences with Métis Nation politics. And I still see this similar sense and feeling of exclusion and marginalization from what they see as like cis-het male-dominated Métis spaces of political engagement, and a deep feeling of silencing and exclusion. And that's where you get, you know, wonderful organizations like, or loose collectives, I would say, like Red River Echoes, that sort of spring up and try to distinguish their voice from, in particular in Manitoba, the Manitoba Métis Federation, and to try to find a safe space to really reflect on how these kinds of constraints are still placed on Métis women and Two-Spirit people around gendered norms around who gets to speak in public realms.
Yeah, so there's the big picture organizing, which comes, like, as you're describing, out of a resistance, right, to how patriarchy has made its way into all aspects of our communities, and, politics being one of them. So there's that. And then I'm interested too in like the smaller ways in which women organize to put a meal on the table or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, where does that come from? And how that happens in like the everyday practice of what we do in community. And I was remembering this thing that Danny Muskwa, who recently passed, he rests in peace, had told me about how when their communities were moving around more seasonally or moving around, how it was the women's job to organize camp, and how when they would how it would be organized spatially when they moved from one place to the other, and how that was a governance function. And he was saying, like, this damn Indian Act, once they put us in these little cabins with, of course, the nuclear families that they imposed as part of heteropatriarchy coming in, that ruined the at least the field in which women were able to organize. But that continues still too, right? So it translates from everything from like a very small practice of what might happen at a community event or something to a much larger practice that is then employed in terms of resistance, right? And you see that across different nations too. So I just like, I'm curious about what that is and why where it comes from, how it works, while at the same time practicing it myself and trying to figure out how do you employ that going forward and do it in such a way that it is also inclusive of everybody having responsibility and accountability for the well-being, right, for all of us going forward. So anyway, I appreciate seeing how it can get mapped out in the in the context that you're talking about, right?
Well, one thing that you're reminding me of is in the course of doing interviews with Métis women about housing in particular, I was reviewing a piece from Polzer and Polzer, I think I'm saying their name right. It's an older book, I think from the 80s or early 90s, on Northern Saskatchewan Métis women's voices.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they mentioned that just really stood out to me was that, even when political organizations are successful in achieving certain kinds of objectives, like, okay, we've secured funding for housing and we're going to build housing, they're like, but women are not consulted in the conversation about what that housing is actually going to look like. So they may get to live in particular spaces, but the very structure, like very architectural work of designing and building the house, is not informed based on their needs, which may involve certain kinds of storage space, larger kitchens in which you can coalesce with the family. And so that I'd never thought about it before until reading that there's even that layer of like lack of, I guess, feminist inclusion or lack of feminist perspective, or what LFMO will call like gender-based analysis, which is very, government-oriented language, but like a GBA plus analytical lens to even thinking about the work there's so many hurdles. The one hurdle is getting any kind of funding at all, or that there's a need for additional housing to be built. Then there's another layer of, well, where does it fall off that we don't center, those who raise children, right? Those may be those who have, to go back to what you were talking about earlier, those who were assigned female at birth and identify as women, but it also may not include those people. It may include those who were assigned male at birth, who are trans women, who, inhabit a range of sexualities and identities and sexual identities, who are charged with primary caretaking, but they're not the voices that get centered in the conversations on how the day-to-day of those things play out. So thank you for that. You're also making me think about the everyday reality of then what happens? How do kind of like formal family networks continue to be drawn on to fill in the gaps in which like broader policies and broader systems can't address?
Yeah, I'm looking at the shifting over time of how those things are playing out, because it reminds me of a story Maria Campbell told me about when they were being they were being forced to move from one place to another, or the consideration was there, like they were being asked to move from one community to the other, and of course the negotiations happen with the men, or not even negotiations. The edict comes down to the men, and the men were saying, well, we can't make that decision, it's up to the women, because they're the ones that are in charge of how, you know, the relations in the community, the kinship, how it's going to operate. And we don't even know if we're going to go there, what the relations are with the other community and so on. So I think that these things are in recent history around the kinds of decisions that women would have based on certain types of responsibilities. And you know, you can see what you're describing here too, about how those things were, you know, changed and shifted as a result of all this kind of imposition, right? So yeah.
We do have a question from Benita Lawrence, so I'll just figure out how to unmute her and let her ask her question. So I think you should be able to ask it. So go ahead, Benita.
Hey there. Wanted to shout out to Kim especially. It's so nice to see you again. I wish I could unmute my video, but they won't let me do that. So just to you know, be face to face momentarily. Yeah, I was interested in this discussion that's been happening and the fact that how much both of you have advanced in your thinking specifically of you, Kim, the many directions your traverse has taken. And I was remembering that in, I think, the work with Danny Musqua that oh, start my video. There we go. It just seemed nice to sort of be able to wave to you, you know. Yeah, one of the things I was remembering, because my whole journey has been a combination of wanting to focus on the nation as a whole and yet being full of, you know, histories of gender violence and also of the strength of gender in my family, my mother as a matriarch. But the one thing I was struggling with was, I think he was talking about how they were struggling to practice menstrual seclusion. And I don't know, I understand there was a huge discourse around that in Toronto years ago, right? And I was just wondering how that kind of functions now with new questions of gender. It's a kind of a tricky question, but I was just curious about that. Or have I misread or misremembered?
You know
like
what?
That.
I got such a bad memory even about my own work that
Yeah. If it's not a big issue, but I think I just remembered the struggle to try and do that in as people were confined to cabins and yeah, you know, and part of the thing with you know, I was wondering if that's part of the, is gender really relevant or how can we move past gender? I was just wondering about that.
Well, and it also gets into this question of embodied experiences and what they have to do to how they inform, you know, who we are in our practices, right? So, you know, bodies that bleed, right, in a certain way, what does that mean in terms of how we organize, how we find our identities, how we find our power, what, you know, how we position ourselves, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I did actually write about like puberty ceremonies, menstrual seclusions, and how people were doing it. The participants that I interviewed, how they were doing it in ways that were possible, you know, during the 50s or whatever. So like just going like behind a curtain in the house and all that kind of stuff. And what, yeah, and I think that does strike at some of the core questions we're asking about gender in terms of bodies, right? And what our bodies do and how that translates into who we are and how we position ourselves. And it's like, you and I have been having these conversations for like
20 years or more,
5+ years, right? I mean, we haven't had them recently, but I remember even back with Reconstructing when I first did it, and I was like discovering my sense of empowerment through being a young mom, who I was when I met you, and you know, the whole things over the politics around the skirt and everything, and me saying, yeah, well, it actually gave me something of a greater understanding of myself and my power. And you're like, yeah, but I never so you were great. You were one of my earliest challengers around all this kind of like empowered mothering and women's bodies and all this stuff I was discovering through, you know, Indigenous teachings, and yet, you know, being challenged around that. And this is, of course, long before a lot of the queer theory that we now have informing how we're going forward, long before a lot of the discussions around trans identities and positions in our communities. So it has changed a lot. That has changed a lot since we're having these more perhaps basic discussions of me going back and like finding out about, like, for example, like the thing around skirts, or, you know, feeling good wearing a ribbon skirt, all that kind of stuff, right?
Well, the other part was, of course, cultural identity, right? That the ribbon skirt also signified cultural identity, which for me was, you know, probably more empowering than the gender part. The gender part I militated against in some ways. You know, it meant a lot of extra work in ways that I think, Jennifer, you talked about the hard work of being Métis women in those contexts that you've mentioned, you know, carrying yourself well, working as domestics, raising generations, doing all these things, right? That, the two kind of, to me, are parts of a struggle. I also remember my former roommate who used to say that, you know, Métis women never had a time to do that. If they were on their periods, they never got a chance to rest. They just had to keep working. But I think that all of those things are important. You know what I mean? That journey that you took, Kim, has empowered so many women. So, you know, I'm not always still kind of, so what about this? Like crotchety old women.
You weren't always challenging. It was just on certain things. It was
That's right.
Yeah. We're ahead of
But
your
anyway,
time.
thank you. You know,
We're ahead of your
just,
time, Anita.
yeah, right. You take care.
Yeah.
Nice to see you, Jennifer, too. Okay.
Thanks. I don't know if you want to add your thoughts, Jennifer.
No, I'm actually listening and learning as we go. But I mean, for my part, I guess I'm trying to think of what wave she would have been, maybe second wave. I was raised by a second wave feminist who had a grade 9 education, so wouldn't have called herself a feminist, but a single mother who was a domestic abuse survivor. And her story remains still one of the most horrific I've heard, that made her feel very passionately and very strongly about women's rights and exclusion and marginalization. And she was adopted. Now we know primarily of settler ancestry, and still piecing together little bits and pieces, but half English we know for sure. But she told me a story about her experience going up against her abusive husband, trying to secure a divorce, and having a female judge, which I think in the 1960s was incredibly rare. And, you know, I remember listening to the story and thinking, great, this is going to be a great moment in feminist history. At which point she says, oh no, the judge, she told me, what are you doing wrong? He's a great husband who goes to work and he tries to, you know, pay for your house and provide for you. So you are doing something wrong. What are you doing that is making him treat you this way? Because you basically deserve it. And she said that never left her. So then, you know, with I think her formative years really being a young mother in the 70s, that catalyzed her what I would say, like, feminism before that was a language accessible. She wouldn't even call herself a feminist now, but that definitely shaped my upbringing in a different way. But then we tussled when I was a teenager over the distinctions between her brand of feminism and marginalization and what my grandmother had experienced. So, you know, it was an interesting space, I think, to kind of grow up and think about these different dynamics and tensions as well. But no, I'm here listening and learning as much as anyone.
I had a question just listening to the two of you, because there's a slightly different emphasis in your you know, in what you said, and actually partly in your work I think it's reflected too, which is the tension between looking at the hard realities of oppression and violence against Indigenous women and not shying away from those realities, and on the other hand, you know, looking to Indigenous ways of knowing and being as empowering, for women and Two-Spirit people, right? And I just wondered about, Kim's actually, I know, written about this because I was reading your work recently for something else, and you talk about saying, I think it's in the Life Stages book where you say, I'm not saying there isn't violence, but that's not the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is to talking about the nurturing practices and the ways in which we've cared for one another, and that we could reclaim these in order to, become empowered as women and as parents and all this kind of thing. And I just wondered about that balance, and I worry about it when I see it in my own students who sometimes want to take up like really difficult topics, because there's both how empowerment versus looking at ways in which Indigenous women are oppressed are taken up in broader public discourses, and then there's also the ways that works on the self, right? And like the care for the self if you're looking at really difficult histories, right? So I don't know if either of you or both of you want to just talk about like making those decisions and when you go into these different places and spaces and so on.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I see it very acutely in the work that I do with LFMO, attending, their meetings for the past 15 odd years. I mean, there are constant conversations coming from women who are like, but we don't want to do this policy work and have people just see us as victims. We are more than this. We need to put forward an empowering narrative. But the constraints of the politics of recognition are such that if you were to paint an empowered narrative, then the government is like, so you're fine, you don't need anything, and we're not going to do anything. And so you wind up in this difficult bind of how do you write empowerment and with empowerment in mind, while at the same time really conveying the fact that, the majority of the 20 odd women that we interviewed live in moldy housing. How do you expound upon the seriousness of that and its impact for chronic health issues for those living in those homes and the children growing up in them? It's very hard to do that in that kind of space. Again, because it's all too easy for politicians to say, well, then you're fine if you're just doing great. And so I think it's always a bit of a delicate balance and an ongoing conversation, right? It's always an ongoing conversation of how do you do that and ensure that you're moving with a recognition of people's humanity and dignity, but also trying to get things done so that people like my late auntie had a trailer that wasn't a one bedroom mold filled trailer for 10 kids. Like, how do you make that happen? Because you do realistically need the resources that stem through some of these organizations. It is very hard to make it happen otherwise. I mean, for me, she's an example of someone who grew up with extended Métis family all over the place. Her kinship ties were strong, but that still didn't get her out of that one bedroom trailer because the legacies of colonization have been far too horrific and effective, I guess, at destroying some of those things. So I think that there's a tension, and I see it reflected in the conversations that Métis women are having about how to channel their political voices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think about it in terms of research and teaching as well. So, there's been this move to like, oh, no more deficit research. We don't want to pathologize Indigenous people, and so on. But we know that, of course, we need to tell certain stories to affect policy and to show, the realities that we need to contend with and so on. But, there is this turn towards like moving away from deficit research, resilience, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's about continuing to think through those balances when you're doing that work. Of course, looking at the systems rather than we need those stories because that's what affects change. That's what moves people. But we also need to constantly be turning the spotlight up on the systems, right? Reminding, weaving all that stuff in, constantly bringing it in about why, right? So that's also when I, because I teach in family relations department. So I, want the students, many of whom are going to come out in kind of like service-oriented work, to know about these realities, to be mindful of the social justice that needs to happen, but not for them to come away with this kind of like deficit narrative around Indigenous people. So you got to, it's always like, okay, here's the history, here's what's going on, blah, blah, blah. Here's the system. Let's understand that. But also look at all the cool stuff people are doing. It's unbelievable, right? That that people are, have managed to carry on with all of this ways of organizing of all this work and the ingenuity of what's going on. Like, so it's coming up with that balance, I think, both when I think about teaching, but also research. What are the stories we tell? What are the stories we need to continue to tell, and to what end? And I made a choice in the life stages book, as you said, Elaine, to not focus on the horrific violence that was going on in the lives of some of the, all of them had experienced hardship, but we didn't talk about those stories, not to dismiss them, but because I wanted to give a little gift, a little gem for people to feel whole, right? To see the hope, to see the potential, all that kind of stuff. But I think they're all important. And I think that, as we work in terms of our own, policy work, research, teaching, all those things, it's a constant question that we have in mind as we're going at it, right?
Yeah, and I think for me, at least a good part of it is also thinking about or emphasizing in that work. I mean, on the scholarly side of things, even if the political narrative that gets channeled, in that recognition framework is one of deficit, that on the scholarly side, then my job is to emphasize the significance of the power and the force and the strength and the continuity of the strength of Métis women and Two-Spirit people in doing this work and coming to these tables, and instead of being erased or silenced, that they're still insisting on being seen. And to me, even if the context over which they're coming together is one of difficulty and struggle, that there is power in that. And then also thinking about the little moments between the formal policy conversations where people are together and beading and teaching other people who don't know how to bead, who have lost that knowledge or never had it, how to bead as well, or cultural performances, or conversations. And I think that there's, it's to be careful to not paint it as the totality of people's lives. That this is one aspect, like you're saying, and it's not the whole picture. It may be a part of it, but it's not the full picture. And that's why for me, I admire the work that the organization's done around the national inquiry and trying to, move away from that hashtag. I think that we all became a little bit too comfortable with hashtag MMIWG2S to say, well, that these are people. These are people who aren't the sum total of what has happened to them. And so many families have done that work of trying to say, our loved ones are more than what has happened. So I think that we see that ongoing in different areas of people trying to say, especially with Cindy Gladue and her mom, and trying to say, like, I don't want the media to paint my daughter in this way. I don't want the media to be able to forget her humanity. So I'm going to push and use the tools available to me with organizations like LFMO to help amplify the voice of who she is as a person. And I think, I find that kind of stuff really inspiring and powerful, but it is a challenge to not allow non-Indigenous people to see only the one side, I think.
And since people are, there's a question. I was going to say there's people are being shy, so I was going to ask another one, but there is a question. So this is from Rhiannon Cobb. She asks, this question is based from something Dr. Anderson said. I'm really curious about your questioning around, should we approach this in a genderless way? I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see this as related to relationality. How do you see relationality speaking differently to approaching issues from a genderless versus a more gender essentialist way of thinking? Or she says, are you looking at somewhere in between or both? So that's a big question. Probably with no answer, but anyway, I'll throw it back to you.
I don't have an answer either. That's why I said I'm trying to figure it out myself, right? But what I have studied throughout my career is how relationality does. Well, obviously, relationality works in a gendered way, and in heteropatriarchal societies, to the detriment of women and two-spirited peoples, right? So it's it's easier to figure out and how to unpack what's wrong with relationality in terms of a gendered relations, looking at patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, and so on. And I've tried to sort of like also think about, oh, what was working in terms of Indigenous cultures, who were non-heteropatriarchal. How did it work? Is there a function for masculinity, for example? Is there a function for the way women organize and, do stuff collectively? Of course, it gets all mixed in because of, none of us are working in a kind of like a pre-colonial context. We don't understand that necessarily, but we can see threads of it, how it works together. But now I'm thinking, well, maybe we need, we need to continue to do work of thinking about where do these gendered relations come from? What are we replicating? And is there a function for it? Like, I don't know. And I follow the lead of my students who are sort of like, RIP gender. So I'm like, okay, RIP gender. What does that leave me with all the stuff that I've done thinking about how gender works in non-patriarchal Indigenous societies, right? And where are we going in the future? Because of course, cultures change over time. We're shifting. We're in a very shifting landscape right now. So, and what does it have to do, if we think about essentialism, what does it have to do with the body and embodied experiences and practices, which is where I started, really. Because, I might have, obviously I was resisting like the confines of what women and girls were faced with as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s, like when Jennifer's talking about her mom and all that stuff, right? But then I might have seen myself in a genderless way going into my adult years, had it not been for the things that my body started to give me, right? So I don't know, like where is the place for that? Well, how do we work out with that? And so I honestly, these are things that I'm just like, I'm trying to figure out. I think we're all trying to figure it out as we go forward, as we work more with queer theory, with queer relationality, as I think more about trans identities and approaches to relationality and gender, and in just like in the everyday relations that I have, right? So I still think, like, where do I fall on this? Am I kind of like, am I on the RIP to gender, position? I don't think so. I think I'm still, because even though sometimes I'm like, well, maybe we should just throw it all out and just, and just go forward in a new way. But I realize that I'm still seeing the value of how I might, for example, enact my identity as an auntie or as a granny instead of a genderless older person. And I think that's like tied into some of the things that Jennifer's describing about how just in naming and talking about her aunties and grannies, or all these women that are working together. There's so much richness there that is gendered, that I don't think I'm ready to give up on it. So, and part of it has to do with the way in which women organize and work together, I think, and the way in which I'm trying to train the next generation or work with the next generation to do the same, which is part of, your responsibility as an older person. But I'm kind of rambling because I'm thinking about this, right? I'm thinking about this. And I greatly appreciate questions and like different approaches and challenges to the work that I've done in the past, right? Okay.
I think this is.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, this is where I really appreciate the work from Chelsea Vowell on her blog early on, in trying to think through the Cree language, how we talk about human positionality in the context of today, what we've been kind of forced into calling gender. I think that is really, helped me a lot, because, some people who are language speakers still hold this knowledge about how what we call gender exists on different planes of existence. And so I found, her work for helping me think through some of this is really important versus, for example, I think I picked up Joe Dion's My Tribe the Crees many years ago, and I think it was Dion who mentions, the notion of cross-cousin marriage, and which has a very gendered, to use that language, component to it, in which, I can marry the sons of, I think it's is it my uncle's children? I'm trying to think. No, I can marry the sons of my aunt's, I can marry my aunt's children, but I can't marry my uncle's because my dad and my uncle are the same. They are both one in each other. My uncle is my dad. And so there's a hinting in his work of like some sort of earlier thinking about borders, boundaries around bodies and identities that is different, because most certainly in an Anglo settler Canadian society, you can't, choose to marry those in recent years. I mean, you could hundreds of years ago, or even 150 years ago, you could marry your first cousin irrespective. So there's still, I think, work to be done around these kinds of things and bringing some of that different or older ways of living to the forefront and putting it in conversation with Chelsea's work and work around the language and how the language really gave us a sense of positionality and family and community, because I think those things, when you put them together, coexist, because, sex and gender, as we call them, are not fixed, right? So, it's, I think these things actually, even though on paper sound like they don't reconcile themselves with each other, they actually do. That doesn't, I apologize, advance the conversation of the question of genderlessness. But I think that there's still a working out of these conversations and questions to be doing at an academic level, especially for like Métis contexts.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really helpful. It reminds me when I was taking in the little, I took my little Mohawk class. I've done the language, dabbling in different languages. I'm like, wow, this is really gendered in terms of the relationality. But what does that mean? Like, what kind of lens are you looking at from how they're gendered, right? And what does that teach us about how we might live in a good way, right? So, yeah, I think reminding me that I'd like to go and do more work with language, right? And think about this. But anyway, I think the next question is a good one for you, Jennifer, too, from Lindsay, about Métis feminism versus Indigenous feminism. I'll make you answer that question, because I have written about Indigenous feminism in a kind of a pan-Indigenous way, looking at the commonalities, I think. So, but there's lots of exciting stuff going on around Métis women, and speaking of organizing, scholars. Do you have a insight on Métis feminism versus Indigenous feminism?
I mean, I think that even some of the, I think Emma LaRocque's earlier work, on being Métis and feminist, it doesn't really define it, right? I think there's not like, this is what it is to be a Métis feminist. This is a distinction. But that's also because in the context of the Métis Nation, and Rob Innes, who is here, I think is a great reminder, his work is a great reminder of this, that like these categories, even especially in the context of the Métis Nation on the prairies, is not as finite. Members of my family lived on reserve and then were enfranchised through the half-breeds withdrawn from treaty and through script processes. So the boundaries and borders between First Nationsness and Métisness wasn't always as distinct in all places. That said, I mean, I think within the growing body of literature and conversation around Métis feminism in the context of Red River, part of it is reflecting on the distinctive histories and experiences. So it's not, to my mind, in as much that people think about their positionality as Métis feminists in different ways from other Indigenous peoples, but it's about the work that has to get done in attending to the differential impacts and consequences of settler colonialism. So this is part of why you do see the splitting out of an organization like LFMO or Women of the Métis Nation, parallel to the separation of the Métis National Council from the broader organization that I'm blanking on the name right now, well, the National Indian Brotherhood, but separating out the Native Council of Canada, sorry, and separating out, because there was a recognition that, like, you know, Métis were not seeking a return to Indian status. We're not seeking the reserve system. And so the aspirations and goals of even non-status Indians was quite distinct. And this led to a bit of a political split. And I think a parallel thing happened for Métis women in saying, well, a lot of the non-status women or First Nations women are addressing issues around status and inclusion on reserve and via the Indian Act. And that's not something that Métis women were thinking about. Because many had been enfranchised and came from legacies of enfranchisement through the script system. So even that legacy and memory was not really a part of what their aspirations were politically. And so I think that some of it to me is seen in how people address what are cultural distinctions, yes, but I think the distinction is more in the conditions, Lindsay, that you mentioned, the context, the specific cultural context and histories. I don't see the cultural context as being vastly distinct when we think about, you know, the Métis being a part of the Iron Alliance, being a part of the Iron Confederacy, the Nehiyahuac Confederacy with First Nations. Clearly, there is a cultural continuity and interconnectedness when you're part of a confederacy together with other Indigenous nations in that way. So I don't know that I would necessarily flag it as a cultural distinction that would separate Métis feminism from any other Indigenous feminism that's brought under the banner of Indigenous feminism, like Anishinaabe feminism from Haudenosaunee feminism. I mean, we could say those are culturally distinct. What I would be cautious about is signaling that Métis feminism is something separate and apart on its own scale. I think that these are all reflective of Indigenous feminisms, but it's the context. And now I'm kind of rambling, but that's my preliminary thinking about it, because there isn't a lot of work around how we might define it specifically. Like your work reflects, Kim. I mean, the way that Métis women live, Maria Campbell's stories, the way that Métis women live is not often wholly distinct from First Nations women on the prairies, right? And in fact, are sisters or cousins or siblings. And so it becomes quite hard to, sisters and siblings are the same, but it becomes quite hard to make some of these distinctions, I think.
Yeah, I certainly would be challenged to come up with that distinctions there. But I do think that there's sort of organizing and coalescing around Métis women scholars that may inform this going forward, right? I think that's an interesting development. Certainly, like I'm one that's I'm cousin to that, but I'm not right in the midst of it, right? So maybe folks like Lindsay will bring us along to the next level of thinking on that, right?
And Métis women have been overrepresented in this series, right? Because we started with Emma LaRocque, and I think the second was Joyce Green. So, and they were pretty vocal as Métis and feminist at a time when that wasn't necessarily the most popular political or scholarly position to take. Benita has another big question, so I'll let Benita unmute herself and ask it. Anyway, it's one that faces all of us in different ways, but there might be gendered aspects to it too. So Benita, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I was actually thinking about now one of the big questions that we're all facing is questions of the land. And in the city, it's manifested as climate change, right? But I think that's one of the, when you were saying, Kim, do we throw out everything about gender? I mean, I think we remain our embodied selves, whether we're, cis female or male, or queer or gender, trans, however we are, we're embodied in those ways. But right now, especially with the heightened issues around climate change and how it really affects people's relationships to land, because it's the war is going on in communities, especially northern and western communities around the rape of the land. So I was thinking that in some ways this may bring a new kind of sort of question around gender and Métis-ness, all of those things. I don't know if anybody's, if you're thinking about that at all, is it becoming part of part of the dialogue. I'm looking at the picture of you, Jennifer, with the lake in the background, right? So yeah, I mean, it's harder to think about in the city, I think, you know, because we get the big storms and the heat, but we're not, you know, facing the resource companies and the violence. So I don't know if I mean, Jennifer, you're doing more sort of political organizing around questions of, as you say, the politics of recognition, right? How governments respond. And Kim, you've always been building up more, challenging the ways in which, you know, Native women have been so misrepresented and created as ugly as objects, you know. But I was wondering about land and how this has started to manifest itself, or has it, in either of your works, you know?
I'll just briefly say that, you know, that we have a history and a discourse around Indigenous women defending the land, right? Often on the front lines, often, you know, taking up that responsibility, being the first ones to resist. I was just watching, Ellen Gabriel's been producing films, which is pretty cool, and watching one of her films that she did about women being defenders of the land, you know. So there's been a history of that. There's lots of talk about that, and some of it equated to the embodied experiences of women vis-a-vis land, right? But you know, what does that mean going forward too? And how, you know, how does it get employed? And what does it mean about other folks' responsibilities? What does it mean about organizing and leadership? I think those
Because it's true, it is really gendered. It is the women who are, you know.
Yeah, and even if you think of some of the, you know, the most like the iconography around land defenders, not all of it's about women, but a lot of it is. So yeah, it is gendered. How does it move going forward in terms of climate change and the challenges that are coming, right? I'm not sure. Jennifer, do you have something clever to say on that?
I mean, I would say that, you know, I see it being increasingly a part of urgent, you know, conversations among, you know, political organizing for Métis women in particular, which is what I can comment to. I know that representatives from LFMO went to, where was the big summit? Not Saudi Arabia. Where was it? Egypt, right? Just went to the big climate summit, have just gone to another, I think, in Vancouver. And I mean, this has always been a part of the conversation, to my experience, with these organizations, because, you know, women depend on the land to grow food for their families, or those who are raising families depend on the land to survive. And I think I've also seen it predominantly in conversations around violence against women, very much. The vulnerability of women who are out on the land, especially in areas where there is resource extraction, like Fort McMurray, how that places women in a particular position of vulnerability and like exposure to violence. I've also seen it in conversations around pharmaceutical companies, and some of the older women that I've talked to and that LFMO works with reflect on the way that pharmaceutical companies, in the rush for new scientific knowledge, often think nothing of coming up to Métis women in their homes out in the country and trying to extract knowledge from them. And they often feel less safe because they don't live on a Métis settlement, or they don't live on a reserve. So they feel that, you know, non-Indigenous people feel much more comfortable approaching them and coming to them and trying to extract knowledge. So I think that, like, I see it in a number of different strands. I also saw it very clearly in the interviews that I did last year with those who were, I forget what age range it was, but more like young people who identify as Métis women in Two-Spirit, around trying to challenge some of the older generations of Métis political organizers and activists to shake off some of their, I guess, detachment from land-based relationships. So I actually see, like, the younger generations are kind of calling out and in older generations who, for matters of survival or whatever reason, have forgotten their responsibilities to and for the land. And so again, organizations like Red River Echoes have done a great job of calling in and out often male-dominated political organizations that seem to make decisions that bring harm to the land without any regard. So I think all these things are always in process, right? And this is kind of an in-process stage where there's a certain level of empowerment that social media has brought that is allowing people to have these conversations and say, hey, wait, why are we consenting to this hydroelectric development without talking to our First Nations relations first, like we would have done prior to like these more mass periods of disruption? So rebuilding those relationships. So I mean, I think again, it's like a work in progress.
It's amazing. And I think it even stems back to, and I think it was some of your earlier work, Kim, where you talked about how basically men who would, you know, agree to signing treaties so they could get jobs, whereas women, if the land was in the women's hands, they thought about the children first, right? So yeah, it does go right back. Anyway, thank you. It's sort of, you made me think about this in a new way. Okay.
And of course, the other big one around land and protection is the water walking, right? I mean, that's an Indigenous women's led
True. Yeah.
assistance in education and all that kind of thing. And it's a spirit, and it's also grounded in spirituality and also women's embodied
Relationship to water. Yeah.
with water and all the teachings that go in and around that, right? Coming from the Anishinaabe, from starting with Josephine Van Damen, right? So there's been leadership around that, and where that's going will be interesting to see too.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it from both of you.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for one, or maybe I'll raise the two questions and you can answer whichever before we close. One is about the difference between Indigenous feminism and Indigenous matriarchies. And the other is about spirituality and gender and gendered roles or genderless experiences.
So I can do a quick one on the first question. I don't use the word matriarch or matriarchies because to me that's like kind of like a counterpoint to patriarchy. It just sort of implies that somebody's the boss and in charge, whereas I have always thought through about these systems of balance and complementarity among genders, right? So when I talk about societies, I talk more about them being often matrilineal, meaning that men moved into women's spaces and women's communities, longhouse communities, or even as in Brenda McDougall's work showing how among the Métis, men were moving into women's spaces, women's communities, which is matrilineal, but not matriarchal in my opinion. But anyway, I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know about the latest debates on that one. I don't know if you, and well, I'll just quickly say, in response to how does spirituality factor in conversations of gendered roles or genderless experiences? Yeah, I mean, this is another one that I'm like working on myself, because I was thinking, okay, if we move away from embodied experiences and talk in questions of spirit, is there a place for masculine and feminine spirit and everything in between? And what does that mean in terms of what it can give us, and how we find ourselves there? So I think that certainly our ceremonies, of course, have been and are gendered, but that's changing too. I see there's places for fluidity in those spaces, and of course, Two-Spirit folks are developing their own lodges and their own spaces for that too right now. So, this is all work that we're doing as we always do in terms of change and transition. And people are thinking about how those things operate in our spirit practices, right? That's my quick one on that, because I want to leave some space for Jennifer. I see we're very short on time.
Yeah, I'll quickly say, I mean, I tend to think of it in the same way. Feminism is really a process of advocacy, right? Like it's really about advocacy work rather than a system of reorienting society. And matriarchy to me speaks in the same way as a sort of system of social management or social control that I don't think reflects at least the women that I work with and conduct research with and speak to and live in relation with, when really it is about restoring the balance That's what the language is always. It's about restoring the balance. We need to bring balance. And what does balance mean? It's not it doesn't mean a binary. It means balance of all Métis who live within Métis families, communities, and the nation. It's not about structuring a binary. And I think matriarchy actually relies far too much on binaristic thinking that is not in the spirit of intent and what people are actually trying to work towards and call for. So that's part of the way that I think about that question. And for me, feminism is, albeit terminologically perhaps problematic or given its origins, I think as a term that speaks to advocacy work, that's where it finds its power and teeth. To the second question, I look more to the work of people like Chantal Fiola. I mean, in my experience, when we ask the creator to see us and hear us, it's not a gendered conversation. I don't need to identify my gender to the creator to have a relationship and a conversation, and nature doesn't ask me what my gender is, you know, when I'm out putting down tobacco. And my child and I don't talk about it in that way. But I think that Chantal's work does a really important job of talking about what it means to be a two-spirit person, coming home to ceremony and engaging with pan-Indigenous ceremonies, but I think more Anishinaabe and Métis specifically. And I think that might actually be a really great person to have come speak in the future if you haven't, but a great person to connect with and speak with.
Great. Well, on behalf of the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages and Elaine at the Center for Feminist Research, we want to thank you for attending the 6th iteration of Indigenous Women Speaker Series. And so much thanks to you, Kim and Jennifer, for your beautiful words, for your sharing and caring, and for having this open space and dialogue. It was certainly wonderful on my end. I have 2 pages of filled notes of kind of great things and lots of questions that I was going to pose, but really wanted to give opportunity for folks who joined us to have that engagement with you. And so thank you so much. We'll be sending out a small gift of thanks of some medicines and bear grease and others from the centers to you as a sign of our thank you and gratitude for joining us today. And thank you to folks who have joined us online and taking the hour and a half to be present with us and to hear this fantastic conversation. So thank you all.